November 20th, 1967, Hill 875, Jac To Province, South Vietnam. The darkness above the jungle canopy was absolute, swallowing even the memory of starlight. The air carried the acrid cocktail of napalm residue, cordite, and the metallic scent of blood mixing with monsoon mud. At 11:47 p.m., the temperature still held at 92 degrees Fahrenheit, but the humidity made breathing feel like drowning in warm syrup. On the scarred summit of Hill 875, surrounded by an estimated 400 North Vietnamese Army regulars, the surviving paratroopers of the 173rd Airborne Brigade faced their fourth consecutive night under siege. The hill had become a graveyard of shattered trees, twisted metal, and broken men. Sergeant Michael Torres held his Zippo lighter above his head, the small flame guttering in the wind like a prayer made visible. Around him, 12 other wounded soldiers did the same, their cigarette lighters creating a desperate constellation against the black earth. The sound reached them first, a distant rhythmic thumping that seemed to pulse with the heartbeats of dying men, the distinctive whop 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 of rotor blades cutting through thick tropical air. The UH-1H Huey, designated Dustoff 65, was climbing toward them through the darkness, its turbine engine straining against altitude and enemy fire. Inside the medical evacuation helicopter, Captain Stephen Bennett adjusted his night vision goggles and spoke into his throat microphone. The words were recorded by the aircraft's voice recorder system, later recovered from the wreckage. His voice was steady, professional, but carried an undertone that every combat pilot recognized, the sound of a man who understood he was flying toward his own death. The decision to launch Dustoff 65 had violated every protocol in the Medical Evacuation Handbook. 4 hours earlier, at Firebase Alpha near Kontum, Major William Hartley had issued a direct order to all helicopter crews: no night evacuations, weather conditions impossible, enemy anti-aircraft fire too intense. The risk-to-benefit ratio was unacceptable according to standard operating procedure. But Captain Bennett had spent 6 months flying medical evacuations in the Central Highlands. He understood mathematics that didn't appear in any manual. Every hour of delay meant 3 more men would bleed out on Hill 875. Every minute meant another soldier calling for his mother in the darkness. The arithmetic of death was simple and ruthless. Bennett's crew consisted of 3 other volunteers who had defied the stand-down. Co-pilot, First Lieutenant James Crawford, a 24-year-old from Minnesota, who had joined the mission despite being 2 days away from completing his tour. Flight engineer specialist Robert Kim, whose job was to operate the rescue hoist and manage the wounded during evacuation. And Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, a combat medic who had requested permission to fly despite having no official assignment to the Dustoff unit. The UH-1H helicopter they flew was a machine designed for impossibility. The Huey's turbine engine produced 1,400 shaft horsepower, enough to lift 4,000 pounds of cargo or 9 stretcher patients. But on this night, the aircraft carried additional fuel tanks, extended range radio equipment, and medical supplies that pushed its weight to the operational maximum. More critically, the helicopter had been modified for medical missions, which meant it carried no defensive armament beyond the crew's personal weapon. The philosophy of the Dustoff units was simple but radical. They were medical personnel first, soldiers second. Their mission was to preserve life, not take it. The red crosses painted on their aircraft were not just identification marks, but declarations of principle. They would fly into hell itself unarmed if wounded men waited at the other end. Captain Bennett had completed 147 medical evacuation missions since arriving in Vietnam. His personal motto, painted on his flight helmet, read, "Death waits for no one." But tonight, as Dustoff 65 climbed through 3,000 feet and began its approach to Hill 875, Bennett was flying into a tactical situation that would test every principle of medical aviation. The weather conditions were marginal at best. Monsoon clouds hung at 4,000 feet, forcing the helicopter to navigate through a narrow corridor of turbulent air. Wind shear from the surrounding mountains created downdrafts that could smash an aircraft into the jungle without warning. But the most dangerous element was invisible to radar and weather instruments. Intelligence reports indicated that North Vietnamese forces had positioned multiple 37mm anti-aircraft guns in the valleys surrounding Hill 875. These Soviet-supplied weapons could track and destroy helicopters at ranges exceeding 2 miles. Their high-explosive shells were designed to detonate in proximity to aircraft, sending thousands of steel fragments through rotor blades, engine compartments, and fuel systems. A single hit from a 37mm round could transform a Huey into falling debris in less than 3 seconds. As Dustoff 65 approached the target area, Captain Bennett reduced altitude to 200 feet above ground level, using the terrain to mask his approach from enemy radar operators. This technique, called nap of the earth flying, required split-second timing and absolute precision. At such low altitude, there was no margin for error. A moment's distraction or a sudden wind gust could send the helicopter into the jungle canopy at 120 miles per hour. The first indication of enemy contact came at 12:23 a.m. Specialist Kim, monitoring the aircraft's defensive systems, reported multiple radar signatures painting the helicopter from different directions. The North Vietnamese had been tracking their approach for several minutes, calculating intercept vectors and preparing firing solutions. Red tracer rounds began rising from the jungle like deadly fireworks, each one marking the path of 4 additional bullets invisible to the naked eye. Bennett initiated evasive maneuvers, throwing the Huey into a series of banking turns that tested the structural limits of the aircraft. The G-forces pressed the crew into their seats, while medical equipment shifted violently in the cargo compartment. Lieutenant Crawford called out altitude and airspeed reading, while monitoring engine parameters for signs of battle damage. But the mathematics of aerial warfare were unforgiving. A helicopter flying at low altitude in a confined area presents a target that even inexperienced gunners can hit. The first 37-meter round detonated 50 meters to the left of Dustoff 65, close enough for the shockwave to rattle the aircraft's aluminum skin. The second round exploded directly below the helicopter, sending fragment patterns through the fuel cell and tail boom. The master caution panel illuminated like a Christmas tree, fuel pressure dropping, hydraulic system compromised, electrical system showing intermittent failures. Most critically, the primary radio system had been severed by shrapnel, cutting off communication with ground forces and other aircraft in the area. Captain Bennett faced a decision that summarized the moral complexity of the Vietnam War. He could abort the mission, return to base, and file a report explaining that hostile fire had made the evacuation impossible. No one would question his judgment. The rules of engagement specifically authorized helicopter crews to withdraw when facing overwhelming opposition. But Bennett could also see the lights below, tiny flames flickering on Hill 875 like votive candles in a cathedral. Each light represented a wounded American soldier who had volunteered to fight in a war that few people understood, for objectives that seemed to change with each briefing. These men had not asked to be heroes. They had simply answered when their country called. Now they were asking for the same response from others. The decision took less than 5 seconds. Bennett increased power and began his descent toward Hill 875, knowing that every man aboard Dustoff 65 understood the implications. They were committing themselves to a landing zone controlled by enemy forces in a helicopter that might not survive the approach, with no guarantee of successful extraction. It was either supreme courage or absolute madness, depending on one's perspective. The landing zone on Hill 875 measured approximately 30 meters in diameter, barely large enough for a Huey to set down with rotor clearance. The surface was torn earth mixed with shell craters and debris from 5 days of continuous bombardment. Worse, the zone was surrounded by enemy positions on 3 sides, making it a perfect killing field for any aircraft attempting to land. Sergeant Torres and his men had improvised landing lights using cigarette lighters, flashlights with colored filters, and even burning pieces of cloth soaked in aviation fuel. The effect was primitive, but effective. From 500 feet altitude, Bennett could see the rough outline of his target, but he could also see muzzle flashes winking from the tree line as North Vietnamese soldiers opened fire with automatic weapons. The approach required a technique called a tactical descent, dropping the helicopter at maximum rate while maintaining forward speed to minimize exposure time. Bennett pushed the cyclic stick forward and lowered the collective, sending Dustoff 65 into a controlled dive that approached the limits of safe flight. The airspeed indicator climbed past the red line as the Huey screamed toward the hillside at nearly 140 miles per hour. At 100 feet above ground, Bennett began his flare, pulling the nose up sharply to convert forward speed into lift. The maneuver created tremendous stress on the rotor system and required perfect timing. Too early, and the helicopter would stall and crash. Too late, and it would slam into the ground at fatal speed. The landing gear touched Hill 875 at 12:41 a.m. Enemy fire immediately intensified, with tracer rounds crisscrossing the landing zone like malevolent lightning. Specialist Kim jumped from the helicopter before the skids had fully settled, running toward the wounded soldiers who were crawling and stumbling toward the aircraft. The first casualty loaded aboard Dustoff 65 was Private First Class David Martinez, 19 years old, from San Antonio, Texas. Shrapnel from a mortar round had severed his right leg below the knee and punctured his abdomen in 3 places. He had been lying in a shell crater for 6 hours, using strips torn from his uniform to create makeshift tourniquet. When Specialist Kim reached him, Martinez was still conscious and asking about his squad leader. The second casualty was Sergeant William Thompson, a career soldier with 12 years of service, who had been caught in an explosive booby trap while checking enemy positions. The blast had destroyed his left arm and embedded dozens of metal fragments in his chest and face. Despite his injuries, Thompson had continued directing defensive fire until blood loss made him too weak to hold his rifle. Loading wounded soldiers into a helicopter under fire is a process that combines medical expertise with combat engineering. Each casualty must be stabilized sufficiently to survive the flight, secured to prevent further injury during maneuvers, and positioned to allow medical treatment during transit. Normally, this process takes between 15 and 20 minutes. On Hill 875, Sergeant Santos accomplished it in 4 minutes and 30 seconds, but those 4 minutes felt eternal to the crew of Dustoff 65. Enemy small arms fire was striking the helicopter at a rate of approximately 1 hit every 10 seconds. Most rounds were deflected by the Huey's aluminum skin or passed harmlessly through empty spaces, but several bullets found critical systems. The fuel gauge showed a rapid drop in pressure as aviation gasoline began streaming from multiple punctures in the main tank. Lieutenant Crawford monitored the engine instruments with growing alarm. Oil pressure was fluctuating wildly, indicating possible damage to the transmission or engine components. Rotor RPM was becoming difficult to maintain, suggesting that the flight controls were compromised. Most ominously, the aircraft's center of gravity was shifting as fuel leaked from the damaged tanks. Captain Bennett made the calculation that every helicopter pilot dreads. Based on fuel loss rate and engine performance degradation, Dustoff 65 had perhaps 10 minutes of flight time remaining. The return trip to Firebase Alpha would take at least 15 minutes under optimal conditions. The mathematics were simple and brutal. There was not enough fuel to make it home, but Bennett also calculated something else. If he could gain sufficient altitude, the helicopter might reach a safe area where the crew could attempt an emergency landing away from enemy forces. The technique was called auto-rotation, using the unpowered rotor blades to slow the aircraft's descent during a controlled crash. It was dangerous under the best circumstances. With a damaged helicopter carrying wounded men, it was nearly suicidal. The takeoff from Hill 875 required maximum power from engines that were already showing signs of severe stress. Bennett pulled collective pitch to the limit, demanding every available horsepower from the turbine, while praying that the transmission would hold together long enough to clear the surrounding terrain. The Huey rose slowly, heavily, like a wounded bird struggling toward the sky. At 50 feet altitude, disaster struck. A burst of automatic rifle fire from a concealed position struck the tail rotor assembly, destroying the pitch control mechanism that allowed the pilot to counter the helicopter's natural tendency to spin. Without tail rotor authority, the aircraft immediately began rotating around its main rotor shaft, creating a condition known as loss of tail rotor effective. Bennett fought for control using every technique taught in survival school, but the laws of physics were unforgiving. The helicopter continued spinning, while gradually losing altitude, its main rotor blades creating a deadly circle of destruction that would kill anyone in its path. The crew had perhaps 30 seconds before centrifugal force would make the aircraft uncontrollable. In those 30 seconds, Captain Bennett made a decision that would define his legacy in the annals of military aviation. Instead of attempting to save the aircraft by landing immediately in the nearest clear area, which happened to be the American perimeter on Hill 875, Bennett used his remaining control authority to steer the spinning helicopter away from friendly forces. The voice recorder captured his final transmission, spoken with the calm professionalism that characterized his entire military career. The words were simple, functional, and completely without self-pity or heroic rhetoric. They reflected the matter-of-fact courage that defined the best of American military aviation. Bennett deliberately crashed Dustoff 65 into the jungle, approximately 200 meters down the hillside from the American positions. The impact occurred at 12:53 a.m., exactly 12 minutes after the helicopter had touched down on Hill 875. The explosion could be seen from Firebase Alpha, 23 miles away, creating a brief orange sun in the darkness of the Vietnamese highlands. The fireball consumed everything within a 50-meter radius. Ancient trees that had survived decades of warfare were reduced to charcoal. The helicopter itself was scattered across an area the size of a football field, its aluminum components melted into unrecognizable fragments. The crew's remains were found still strapped into their seats, suggesting that none of them had attempted to abandon their posts in the final moment. Investigation of the crash site revealed the full extent of Bennett's final sacrifice. By steering away from the American perimeter, he had prevented the spinning helicopter from crashing into the defensive positions where dozens of soldiers were treating wounded and preparing for the expected enemy assault. His decision to die 200 meters away from friendly forces had saved an estimated 43 American lives. The 4 wounded soldiers aboard Dustov 65 died in the crash, their injuries too severe to survive the impact and subsequent fire. Private Martinez, Sergeant Thompson, and 2 other paratroopers whose names were recorded only in casualty reports became part of the 58,318 Americans who would die in Vietnam. Their families received telegrams expressing the nation's gratitude and folded flags that had flown over battlefields they would never understand. But the story of Dustov 65 did not end with the crash. Radio intercepts revealed that North Vietnamese forces had monitored American communications frequencies and were aware of the medical evacuation attempt. Enemy commanders had positioned additional troops around Hill 875, specifically to shoot down the helicopter. Understanding that destroying medical aircraft would demoralize American forces and demonstrate the futility of continued resistance. The psychological warfare aspects of the Vietnam conflict often targeted the compassionate instincts that defined American military culture. By attacking medical personnel and facilities, enemy forces sought to break the moral foundations that sustained American fighting spirit. The sacrifice of Dustov 65 represented both the nobility and the tragedy of this moral dimension. Dawn on November 21st revealed the full scope of the battle for Hill 875. American forces had suffered 158 casualties during the 4-day engagement, with 42 killed in action. North Vietnamese casualties were estimated at over 300, but enemy forces had successfully withdrawn during the night, carrying most of their dead and wounded. The hill itself was declared secure, but within 72 hours, American forces abandoned the position due to its tactical irrelevance. The official after-action report on the loss of Dustov 65 filled 14 pages of typewritten text, analyzing everything from weather conditions to equipment performance. The document concluded that Captain Bennett's crew had violated standing orders by attempting the night evacuation, but acknowledged that their actions were consistent with the highest traditions of military medical service. What the official reports could not capture was the emotional impact on surviving members of the 173rd Airborne. Veterans of Hill 875 carried the memory of that helicopter sound for the rest of their lives. The distinctive rhythm of Huey rotor blades became a ghost sound that could trigger instant recall of November 20th, 1967. For 31 years, the crash site of Dustov 65 remained hidden beneath jungle vegetation that quickly reclaimed the scarred earth. Tropical growth in Vietnam is voracious, covering the evidence of human conflict with green amnesia. By 1975, when American forces completed their withdrawal, the wreckage was already invisible beneath 20 feet of secondary jungle growth. The rediscovery occurred by accident in 1998, when Vietnamese farmers clearing land for coffee cultivation uncovered fragments of aluminum and steel buried in the red laterite soil. Among the debris was a dog tag bearing the name Bennett Stephen P. and a serial number that matched casualty records maintained by the Defense Department's POW MIA office. The Vietnamese government, as part of ongoing efforts to normalize relations with the United States, granted permission for American recovery teams to excavate the crash site. The operation took 6 weeks and involved archaeologists, forensic specialists, and explosive ordnance disposal technicians who carefully sifted through 3 decades of jungle deposition. The recovered remains of Dustov 65's crew were transported to the Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii, where forensic anthropologists used advanced techniques to identify individual casualties. The process took 18 months, but eventually confirmed that all 4 crew members had been accounted for. Their remains were returned to families for burial with full military honors. The memorial service for Captain Bennett took place at Arlington National Cemetery on a grey morning in March 2000. The ceremony included a flyover by 4 UH-1H helicopters from the Army's ceremonial unit, their rotor blades creating the sound that had become synonymous with American involvement in Vietnam. Among the attendees were 7 veterans of Hill 875, including Sergeant Torres, who had held the cigarette lighter that guided Dustov 65 to its landing. But the true memorial to Bennett's crew existed in the continuing mission of military medical aviation. Every medical evacuation helicopter in the American military carried a small plaque inscribed with the motto, "That others may live." The words captured the essential philosophy that had motivated Bennett's final flight, the belief that preserving life justifies any sacrifice. In the years following the recovery of Dust-Off 65, military historians began to recognize the engagement at Hill 875 as a microcosm of the entire Vietnam experience. American forces had demonstrated extraordinary courage and technical competence while pursuing objectives whose strategic value remained questionable. The battle had been won tactically, but lost strategically, a pattern that would define the entire conflict. The helicopter itself became a symbol of American technological superiority and moral complexity. The UH-1H was simultaneously an instrument of war and mercy, capable of delivering devastating firepower or life-saving medical care depending on its configuration and mission. This duality reflected the broader contradictions of American involvement in Southeast Asia. Modern military medical doctrine still reflects lessons learned from operations like the Dust-Off 65 mission. Contemporary medical evacuation procedures emphasize risk assessment and crew survivability, acknowledging that dead medical personnel cannot save additional lives. The balance between compassion and pragmatism remains a fundamental challenge in combat medicine. The helicopter pilots who followed Bennett's generation inherited both his technical skills and his moral burden. Flight training programs began emphasizing decision-making under extreme stress, recognizing that combat aviation often requires choices between competing values. The ability to calculate odds while maintaining humanity became the defining characteristic of elite aircrew. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Dust-Off 65 was its demonstration of voluntary sacrifice in an involuntary war. Captain Bennett and his crew had not been drafted into their mission. They had volunteered for a task that everyone understood was likely suicidal. Their decision to fly represented the essential nobility that coexisted with the tragedy of Vietnam. The political complexity of the Vietnam conflict often obscured individual acts of courage that transcended ideology and strategy. Men like Bennett operated according to moral codes that existed independently of government policy or public opinion. They flew because wounded soldiers needed them to fly. The calculus was simple, even when the consequences were fatal. In the broader context of American military history, the Dust-Off 65 mission represented a tradition of service that extended from Valley Forge to Normandy to Afghanistan. Each generation of American soldiers had faced moments when duty required actions that exceeded reasonable expectations. The decision to continue flying despite overwhelming odds was part of this continuum. The technical innovation that characterized American military aviation also continued to evolve from experiences like Hill 875. Modern medical evacuation helicopters carry armor plating, defensive systems, and sophisticated navigation equipment that might have saved Bennett's crew. But they also carry the same moral imperative that motivated the original Dust-Off units. The sound of helicopter rotor blades remains one of the most emotionally charged acoustic signatures of the Vietnam era. For veterans, the rhythmic thumping immediately evokes memories of approaching salvation or impending doom, depending on circumstances. The same sound that brought hope to wounded soldiers on Hill 875 brought terror to enemy forces throughout the conflict. Contemporary discussions of the Vietnam War often focus on political decisions and strategic failures, while overlooking the individual moments of grace that occurred within the larger tragedy. The flight of Dust-Off 65 represented one such moment, when ordinary men chose to become extraordinary through voluntary sacrifice. The question that haunts every analysis of Bennett's final mission concerns alternative outcomes. Could different decisions have saved the crew while still accomplishing the evacuation? Military historians have conducted extensive studies of the tactical situation, but the mathematics of hindsight cannot account for the fog of war that obscured options available to participants. What remains indisputable is the fact that 4 Americans chose to die rather than abandon their wounded comrades. This choice was made without fanfare or publicity, in circumstances that guaranteed their sacrifice would remain unknown for decades. They flew into darkness because darkness was where they were needed. The moral landscape of combat aviation contains no easy answers or comfortable certainty. Pilots must balance competing imperatives of mission accomplishment, crew survival, and preservation of innocent life. The decision matrix becomes more complex when the mission involves saving lives rather than taking them. Captain Bennett's leadership during the final minutes of Dust-Off 65 demonstrated the principles taught in every military command school, but rarely tested under such extreme circumstances. His ability to maintain crew coordination while managing multiple emergencies reflected training that prepared officers for the impossible. The investigation that followed the crash revealed systemic issues within military medical aviation that extended far beyond the tactical situation at Hill 875. Equipment reliability, crew training, and operational procedures all required modification based on lessons learned from similar missions throughout Vietnam. But bureaucratic improvements could not address the fundamental moral challenge faced by every dust-off crew. The decision to risk 4 lives to save force created ethical equations that defied mathematical analysis. The calculus of sacrifice operated according to values that existed outside normal cost-benefit framework. The families of Dust-Off 65's crew members struggled for decades with questioning their loved one's final mission. Was Bennett's decision heroic or reckless? Could alternative approaches have achieved the same result, with less risk? These questions reflected the broader national debate about Vietnam that continued long after the last American troops departed. Yet among the veterans who served on Hill 875, no such questions existed. They understood that Bennett had responded to their call for help with complete disregard for personal safety. The philosophical debates that occupied academics and politicians were irrelevant to men who had been bleeding in the darkness, waiting for salvation that arrived in the form of helicopter rotors. The transformation of the Dust-Off 65 story from forgotten tragedy to recognized heroism required 31 years, and the accidental discovery of aircraft debris. This delay reflected the broader American reluctance to examine Vietnam experiences that challenged comfortable narratives about victory and defeat. The helicopter crew's sacrifice occurred within a conflict that produced few clear victories or noble defeats. Most Vietnam experiences were ambiguous, marked by moral complexity that resisted simple interpretation. The story of Dust-Off 65 was unusual because it contained elements of traditional heroism that transcended political debate. Modern military medical evacuation procedures incorporate sophisticated risk assessment protocols that might have prevented Bennett's mission from launching. Computer models can calculate probability of survival based on multiple variables, including weather, enemy threats, and aircraft performance. But such models cannot measure the moral imperative that drove the original Dust-Off crews. The technological gap between 1967 and today encompasses more than improved equipment and enhanced procedures. Contemporary military operations occur within information environments that provide commanders with real-time intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. Bennett flew into Hill 875 with limited knowledge about the tactical situation awaiting, but information superiority cannot eliminate the fundamental challenge of combat decision-making under stress. Every military leader must eventually choose between competing priorities while operating with incomplete knowledge and limited time. The ability to make correct decisions under such circumstances remains the essence of effective command. The crew of Dust-Off 65 faced their final minutes with the professionalism that characterized American military aviation throughout the Vietnam conflict. Radio transcripts revealed no panic, no recrimination, no abandonment of discipline. They died as they had lived, following procedures and supporting each other until the very end. This maintenance of military bearing under extreme stress reflected training that began in flight school and continued throughout operational careers. The ability to function effectively while facing death was not natural but learned, developed through repetitive practice of emergency procedures until correct responses became automatic. The psychological preparation for combat aviation included acceptance of mortality as a routine occupational hazard. Helicopter pilots in Vietnam faced statistical odds that made their survival questionable over extended periods. The decision to continue flying required a form of controlled denial that allowed focus on mission accomplishment rather than personal risk. Yet the crew of Dust-Off 65 was motivated by more than professional duty or personal courage. Their willingness to attempt the Hill 875 evacuation reflected moral convictions about the value of human life that transcended military regulations and operational procedures. They flew because wounded soldiers needed them to fly. This moral foundation sustained American military medical units throughout Vietnam and continues to motivate contemporary medical evacuation crews in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflict zones. The principle that no wounded soldier should be abandoned remains a core value of American military culture. The rediscovery of Dust-Off 65's wreckage in 1998 coincided with renewed American interest in Vietnam War history. driven partly by aging veterans' desire to share their experiences before death claimed their generation. The helicopter crew's sacrifice became part of this broader effort to preserve lessons learned through suffering. The debate about Vietnam's meaning and legacy will continue as long as Americans seek to understand their nation's role in global affairs. But certain truths transcend political interpretation. Men like Captain Bennett and his crew volunteered to serve their country and died trying to save their comrades. These facts require no ideological framework for appreciation. The sound of approaching helicopters continues to evoke powerful emotional responses from Vietnam veterans, triggering memories that remain vivid decades after the original experiences. For some, helicopter rotors represent salvation and hope. For others, they recall terror and loss. All remember the men who flew them. Today's military medical evacuation helicopters carry advanced life support equipment, satellite navigation systems, and defensive countermeasures that would have seemed miraculous to the dust-off crews of 1967. But they also carry the same moral imperative that motivated Bennett's final flight: the conviction that American military personnel who volunteer to serve their country deserve every possible effort to bring them home alive. The technological evolution of military aviation reflects broader changes in American society and military culture. Modern helicopter crews operate within information networks that provide unprecedented situational awareness and decision support. Yet they still face the same fundamental choice that confronted Captain Bennett on November 20th, 1967, whether to risk their own lives to save others. The answer to that question depends on values that technology cannot supply. Courage, compassion, and commitment to service must be developed within human hearts, not computer systems. The legacy of Dust-Off 65 reminds us that these values remain essential elements of military effectiveness. The crew members who died in the crash were ordinary Americans who had volunteered for extraordinary service. Captain Bennett was a career officer from Ohio who had planned to retire after 20 years and return to civilian aviation. Lieutenant Crawford was a college graduate who had joined the Army to fulfill his military obligation. Specialist Kim was a recent immigrant whose family had fled North Korea during the war there. Sergeant Santos was a medic who had enlisted to learn skills that would help him become a physician. None of them had sought heroic status or historical recognition. They had simply answered when their country called and died trying to save their comrades. Their sacrifice represented the best traditions of American military service, even within a conflict that challenged many assumptions about American power and purpose. The families of Dust-Off 65's crew members eventually found some measure of peace through the recovery and identification of their loved ones remain. But the emotional cost of their sacrifice extended beyond immediate family members to include the men who had called for medical evacuation on Hill 875. Survivor guilt affected many veterans of the engagement, who struggled with questions about whether the crew's deaths had been justified by the attempt to save wounded soldiers. These psychological wounds reflected the broader trauma experienced by Vietnam veterans, who often returned to a society that questioned the value of their service. The delayed recognition of Bennett's heroism paralleled the broader American reconciliation with Vietnam veterans that began in the 1980s and continued through the construction of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. The Black Granite Wall became a place where the nation could honor individual sacrifice while acknowledging the complexity of the larger conflict. The inscription of Bennett's name on Panel 30E of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial marked his transition from casualty statistic to honored hero. But for the veterans who had served on Hill 875, no inscription was necessary. They remembered the sound of his helicopter approaching through the darkness and knew that he had answered their call. The moral lessons embedded in the Dust-Off 65 story extend beyond military aviation to encompass broader questions about service, sacrifice, and moral choice in complex circumstances. Bennett's decision to attempt the evacuation, despite overwhelming odds, reflected values that civilian society claims to honor, but rarely tests under such extreme conditions. Contemporary American military operations continue to face similar moral challenges, as commanders balance mission requirements against personnel safety in environments where perfect solutions do not exist. The ability to make correct decisions under such circumstances requires both technical competence and moral clarity. The technological sophistication of modern military equipment sometimes obscures the fundamental human element that determines mission success or failure. The crew of Dust-Off 65 died because their helicopter was shot down, but they had placed themselves in harm's way because of values that no technology could supply. These values, courage, compassion, loyalty, and sacrifice, remain essential components of effective military service despite decades of technological advancement. The men who volunteer to serve their country in contemporary conflicts face the same fundamental choices that confronted Bennett and his crew on November 20th, 1967. The story of Dust-Off 65 reminds us that heroism often occurs in circumstances that receive no immediate recognition or reward. The crew members died in obscurity, their sacrifice known only to the men they had tried to save. Their heroism was complete without publicity or acclaim. This quiet heroism characterized many aspects of American military service in Vietnam, where individual acts of courage occurred daily within a larger conflict that defied simple moral category. The men who served understood their duty even when the nation struggled to understand the war. As we reflect on Captain Bennett's final flight, we confront questions that extend far beyond military aviation or Vietnam history. What obligations do we owe to those who volunteer to serve in our name? How do we balance competing moral imperatives when perfect solutions are impossible? What price are we willing to pay to uphold the values we claim to cherish? These questions remain relevant as contemporary American military forces operate in complex environments around the world, facing challenges that require both technical expertise and moral courage. The legacy of Dust-Off 65 provides guidance for future generations who will face similar choices. The helicopter that crashed on Hill 875 carried no weapons except the personal sidearms of its crew members. Its mission was purely humanitarian, dedicated to preserving life rather than taking it. Yet the crew members died as surely as any infantry soldier, killed by an enemy that made no distinction between combatant and medical personnel. This violation of international law reflected the broader character of the Vietnam conflict, where traditional rules of warfare were often ignored by both sides. The targeting of medical personnel and facilities represented a deliberate strategy designed to undermine American morale and fighting effectively. But the strategy ultimately failed because it misunderstood the moral foundation of American military service. The willingness of crews like Dust-Off 65 to continue flying despite being targeted demonstrated that some values cannot be destroyed by violence or intimidation. The courage displayed by Captain Bennett and his crew was not unique among American military medical personnel in Vietnam. Similar acts of heroism occurred throughout the conflict, performed by men who understood that their primary mission was saving lives, not taking. The Dust-Off units flew over 500,000 medical evacuation missions during American involvement in Vietnam, saving an estimated 900,000 lives. These statistics reflect the cumulative impact of individual decisions made by crews who chose to answer calls for help despite personal risk. Modern military medical evacuation capabilities are built upon the foundation established by units like Dust-Off 65, whose experiences provided lessons that continue to save lives today. The same moral imperatives that motivated Bennett's crew drive contemporary medical personnel who serve in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflict zones. The technology has changed dramatically, but the essential mission remains the same: bringing wounded soldiers home alive. This mission requires not only technical skill, but also the moral courage to risk one's own life for others. As we honor the memory of Captain Stephen Bennett and his crew, we acknowledge that their sacrifice represents something larger than individual heroism. Their deaths symbolized the moral complexity of American involvement in Vietnam and the continuing challenge of balancing competing values under extreme stress. The crew of Dust-Off 65 made their final choice in darkness, guided only by the small flames held by wounded soldiers who trusted that help would come when they called. Their faith was answered by men who understood that some obligations transcend personal safety or rational calculation. In the end, the helicopter that burned in the jungle near Hill 875 carried more than medical equipment and wounded soldiers. It carried the hopes and values of a nation struggling to understand its role in it. The crew members who died in that crash became symbols of the best aspects of American military service, even within a conflict that challenged many assumptions about American power and purpose. Their legacy reminds us that heroism is not measured by victory or defeat, but by the willingness to serve others regardless of personal cost. The men of Dust-Off 65 embodied this principle through their final flight, creating a standard of service that continues to inspire those who follow. Do we, as Americans, still possess the moral courage demonstrated by Captain Bennett and his crew? Are we worthy of the sacrifice made by those who answered when duty called? These questions challenge each generation to examine its own commitment to the values that define our nation. If this story of sacrifice and heroism has moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share this video with others who need to remember that freedom's price is always paid by those brave enough to fly into the darkness when others are in need. Honor their memory, share their story, keep their legacy alive.